What is up, y'all? It's your boy Anarchy coming at you with the My Hero Academia chapter 327 review. Just gonna get right into it. This chapter entitled Rest, which I think was heavily ignored, but that's okay. So, as you already know, we pretty much go for the play-by-play. Opening scenes of the chapter, of course, seeming a bit absurd, but the idea of them giving him the bath, it kind of shocks me that it seems like a lot of people were upset this bath was made into a joke when the fandom itself has been cracking jokes about how Deku need a bath for at least 2 months now. But hey, whatever. I think that's just kind of Horikoshi knowing that everybody's been waiting for Deku to take a bath for a while now, and he thought he'd make a joke with us. But really what this does is more of what I expect and what this arc is supposed to be about, which is establishing what we're going to see for the back end of the saga, for the final stage of this series. I think a lot of people thought this arc was supposed to be a self-contained, but really it's more of a provisional license arc of the last act of the last saga. It's designed to introduce you to what we're going to be expecting, what kind of dynamics, and what the conflict overall of the entire series is going to be centered around going forward. So, just saying. But as we have the students establishing it, Ochako is specifically allowed to go to sleep. Some people think this is a little rushed, but this is actually more about the idea that the whole premise of Deku being brought back, which Todoroki directly states, is he's supposed to be resting here. And it's important to note that Ochako was most worried about him being safe. She wanted to make sure she could get him home. She didn't want him out there hurting. She didn't want him out there struggling. And more than likely, if you looked at the costumes, you noticed that like Shoto, Bakugo, Uraraka, and Ida had some of like the more heavily damaged costumes. Definitely had probably been out there the most. And Uraraka finally being able to rest properly, more than likely for the first time in several months, in a month, just like Deku's first proper rest in a month. And what this really does is allow for them to both, when they finally do get to speak and talk to each other, to interact on their best form and best selves while properly rested, but so they can also have an honest conversation, because Ochako isn't probably going to just let it completely slide that he totally shut her out and didn't tell her, because obviously there is that frustration and proximity and closeness, but also that genuine care. And the same with Midoriya, him seeking her out, obviously showing that he wants to reach out and talk to her about leaving more specifically. And that in of itself should indicate that we are setting up for them to be able to have a conversation, more than likely in a one-on-one environment, without having to separate themselves in the class, but just getting to focus on it in a more naturally occurring setting. Furthermore, the scene with MIna and All Might, I think it's interesting because some people wanted us to focus more on Mina's trauma, but the idea of her lashing out and speaking up and yelling at All Might, and her being worried about being left in the dark, is partially a response and a byproduct of said trauma of losing a teacher and having one just vanish off into the wild with no clue or context as to completely like what he's going to be doing, especially in the case of All Might, who's lost his powers, is unsettling, especially given the society and the state everything is in. Furthermore, what I like about this is that if you've noticed, since we gotten this moment in the war when she failed to throw the vial, we've been getting a lot more of MIna talking on screen, a lot more emphasis on what she thinks and what she feels. She's been asserting herself, getting more dialogue in general, which I think means that as we're transitioning into this next phase of the story, that we're going to be getting more MIna. MIna is going to be a bigger player in the plot going forward. This is my expectation. This is why we keep getting her dialogue, so none of this is going to be wasted, especially with her being one of the people highlighted in the panel next to Momo when we were looking at Corpse of Midnight. So, we got All Might here establishing that he had convinced himself that he wasn't a combatant anymore. This does seem to imply that he's fully intent on going back into combat. Deku and All Might don't spend a bunch of time talking, but they do agree to like work together and to be encouraged. And while this may seem anticlimactic, I want to point out that this is the same series where just like less than 10 chapters ago, I want to say, Suyu directly told him that Deku was trying to live a comic book hero fantasy. So in turn, while we look at the stakes and we understand that within the stakes of the story, yes, this is an extremely important moment it's supposed to be an extremely important moment for the main character, and Sensei and Deku, they split apart and it was really bad. But for them, it's like, no, you guys both ran off and decided to be idiots, and now you've been brought back home. So that's the perspective we need to look at it too, to a certain degree, that they made a mistake in cutting out the UA students. They made a mistake in like cutting out this next generation, these people who are going to be needed for combating on the front lines of this like forthcoming conflict. So the idea that they would just get cut out is a huge mistake on their part, and therefore it kind of reduces the whole situation, because they didn't have to have main character syndrome. Even if even if Deku is the main character, he doesn't need to be thinking he's the main character in real life. And so the interaction and the way people carry that situation kind of reflects that. Now, it's worth noting that Tokoyami still hasn't been able to talk to Hawks much. He seems very upset about that. And with Endeavor and all of them just not necessarily talking a lot, obviously the heroes and kids are frustrated. They were going to try to talk to Midoriya more. All right, so we get an establishment that All Might is acquired new intel from Stain. That's when we get the confirmation that it's more than just some random ravings or anything like that Stain is going to be sending him. We get notes that he has some form of intel. We get this idea that because of the threat Dabi represents, all of the Todoroki family have been going through it. Shoto especially, when you think about the fact that some people would remember his extremely dangerous showing at the sports festival, then seeing the way that Dabi was acting like that, they might see him as just a ticking time bomb too. And when you think about how the provisional license emphasized Shoto not getting along with people because he was carrying on that same bitterness and hostility and the same attitude that Endeavor had been doing, you kind of get the idea that, okay, Shoto is fully completing some of these arcs, or starting to get to ramping up at some of these character moments where he's understanding where he went wrong and why his personality has needed to adapt, and also understanding the ways in which that trauma he kind of projected onto others and carried on forward, and how he's tried to improve and work on that since then. Building off of the Culture Festival and Jiro, we see that she decides to grab Momo, Kaminari, Tokoyami, and I guess it's worth mentioning that we did have Tokoyami and Kaminari bring up the Culture Festival during the middle of the war. So I guess Horikoshi making sure that we keep this idea that there's more to them being heroes than just fighting is important. I think it's worth noting, though, that them wanting to do something kind and putting on a show for people and constant is kind of like a byproduct of them always knowing that they need to put the other people first, and they were always trying to put the civilians on the line, put themselves on the line for the civilians first. And the idea here is especially worth noting when you get to the last pages and you realize that it's been a month since the end of the war. It's been a month since many of these people have, like, if you are within close proximity to UA and you see all this damages, all these people have been struggling for about 2 or 3 weeks. The odds of most of them having proper internet access seems pretty low. There's going to be, less communication, less sources of entertainment. In general, the morale is going to keep spiraling as long as they're just kind of stuck waiting for the bad times to happen. You do have to balance these things out, and in turn, them attempting to do something good for the crowd and for the evacuees can easily spiral into an especially dangerous situation, as if they're putting on a show and everybody's distracted and there's all this loud noise and somebody starts an attack on UA, it could impact the way they get to respond to it, or their way, whether or not they're fully capable of responding in the appropriate measures in the appropriate time frame. So this does create vulnerability within the UA that has already been concerned about it due to the fact that Deku is going to be there. Now, we see that the heroes are trying to make a preemptive strike. This is something that could easily backfire and likely will backfire from how I look at it, because I'm glad this is finally being brought up. Dr. Garaki is stated in the info books to have had access to Tartarus. He's one of the most renowned doctors, quirk doctors in the entire story of MHA. And it's been important and necessary because I've talked about this before, I believe. I talked about it on stream this week. All for One got his original quirk extracted while he was in Tartarus. This is not something that happened before he got arrested. Why do we know this? Because while he was at Kamino, he was still collecting the quirks for Shigaraki. At Kamino, he specifically turned down taking Best Jeanist quirk because he decided it would not fit Tomura Shigaraki's disposition. Why would that impact his decision if he was using the copy and using the fake All for One at that time? Garaki is the most renowned. He's got multiple orphanages. They even made it a point to mention a few chapters back that they had to target and raid multiple bases of his. So they didn't even just attack his hospital that they knew he was at. They attacked multiple hospitals and likely encountered multiple Nomu in those too. Maybe they had security fail-safes to make sure that they at least attempted to protect. We don't know for sure. But we do get the confirmation that it's been at least a month since the day they broke out of Tartarus. And they are expected to have 1 month left in finding All for One before Shigaraki is complete. But based on the records that they're finding, they're worried that it might not be actually taking that long because they can utilize the technologies at Tartarus. Even looking at Tartarus, while there's definitely damage to the bridges and the road and the area around it, it doesn't seem that Tartarus itself is completely destroyed, which would make sense because at the end of the day, why would you take the time to try to destroy the entire base when you need to prioritize getting out, especially considering it was an undersea prison? So from the extra technology that was available at Tartarus to information and files, it makes sense that All for One of them might be using that as one of their bases now, a place that they've taken and locked down under their power once more people fled from these areas and after the other prisons were broken into. Overall, I actually really enjoyed this chapter because it kind of sets up an idea and further emphasizes how they're going to be reaching out, how Class 1A is generally going to be working together and moving closer to the forefront of the story as we progress. Furthermore, it's worth noting that if they decide to throw a show together, let's say tomorrow, then what you actually open the door for is these kids who are out here throwing together a quick routine and show while Deku and Ochako get some time alone, which basically means that we could be getting the setup for Horikoshi to just try to finally give us the romantic moment and like seal the deal on that. Basically creating a date night in the middle of all of this chaos so that there's at least a small moment of happiness for Deku before we get into the nitty gritty. Because with the heroes being on the move, with them going to Tartarus, they are running the risk of running into another Nomu Den. And running into a Nomu Den with just Endeavor, an old All Might, Best Jeanist, and seemingly no plumage Hawks does not seem like an advantageous position because, and I think this is also why we get this shot, if Hawks had his wings back to a useful degree, he would be in the air next to Endeavor, who has finally gotten to a point where he can consistently fly without worrying about overheating and do it as a primary method of travel instead of just being inside the vehicle with them. Endeavor's training throughout the story has been consistently highlighted through small improvements and just various usages of multiple techniques or combining techniques, like when he combined Hell Spider with Prominence Burn against Shigaraki in the middle of the air. Just a lot of advancement, a lot of emphasis on what the power of the number one hero really is like, and seeing him consistently progress all these ways and still not be close to All Might, it's kind of mind-blowing. Just kind of emphasizes the levels that Deku and All Might get to operate at due to the power of One for All. I do think that something very important that Night Eye said about All Might's death sticks out to me, and it's that he told him that if he continues on the path of being a hero, he will effectively die to a heinous villain. And I remember something that he said was that if people opted to do something differently, oftentimes it would be like filler scenes could be added, but the film would ultimately readjust itself. And I know a lot of us emphasize, and there's people who strongly believe that Izuku Midoriya truly bent the future during the overhaul arc. And I like that on a sentimental level. Sure, that's really nice, but I always look at the fact that Eri was rewinding him And I always think about the fact that he could have easily seen a moment where Deku would have died, got hit, but it didn't matter because he was rewound. And he didn't have that context to know there's multiple ways that this could have been done, where due to Aries' presence and the fact that she's able to rewind Deku for a large part of the time that he's above the surface, it's hard to know, especially if maybe, just maybe, that created a time variable. And if that's the case, then what Night Eye predicted for All Might was that within like 5 to 6 years. You can look at it as Kamina was when he should have died, but I look at that as if Kamina was supposed to set him up to die. If he would have like been bold and kept running out there trying to be a hero, if he had kept fighting, if you continue on this path, Night Eye said. So the way I look at it is, by him stepping off that path, he added some filler scenes. He added some time padding, which maybe those being like filler scenes is part of why All Might, while he's been in the story, hasn't really felt like he was doing a lot, but being depressed. Just those filler scenes, time where he wasn't actually supposed to be here anymore. And we might be getting to a point where now that he's getting back on the main track, trying to be active again as a hero, that he's going to be running into that death that Night Eye warned him of. And this could be the danger behind all this. And so he gave Deku and All Might one last warm moment when they couldn't really afford to have some giant speech and argument and emotional moment, which is also why Deku didn't immediately go to his mother. Obviously he needed to be cleaned off and all that other stuff for sanitary purposes and put to bed, and likely they have security measures set up so that parents and people aren't just moving in between, to and fro between the UA students' dorms and where the refugees are supposed to be. Obviously that's not the ideal situation, but if we're going to be honest, it makes the most sense for Deku and his mom to have that conversation, maybe with All Might there, or possibly even alone, just like it makes the most sense for Deku and Ochako to have that conversation with just the two of them, if you know what I mean. So yeah, the optimal situation for Deku and his mother is for them to get some time separate of everyone else to talk about how they feel about this and the sacrifice he's really making going forward. The same thing with Ochako, getting to really hopefully help Deku find a reason to finally stay grounded and stay right next to and be together and work with 1A going forward. Let me know what you guys think down below. I hope you guys appreciated the rest chapter that was about resting. I know a lot of people want to dive into all the stressful things, but that's kind of counterintuitive to what the narrative is supposed to be about. And as they set up for the show, as they decide what their song and stuff like that is going to be, I'm sure that's going to play into how what they've been through is going to play into that, and that's going to help get us to see their perspectives and how the trauma has impacted them and how that's going to shape what they want to do and the kind of heroes they want to be going forward. So again, let me know what you guys think. If you enjoyed the video, like, comment, subscribe. Hail Hori, that's all I really got to say. Hope to see you on Sundays for the Church of MHA. I'm Aniki, and I'm out.